Hey everyone, Moms Against Medical Bullying. So I just want to start this video with a quote from Dr. Charles Creighton's book. And the quote is, "It is difficult to conceive what will be the excuse made for a century of cowpoxing, but it cannot be doubted that the practice will appear in as absurd a light to the common sense of the 20th century as bloodletting now does to us." Unfortunately, that's not the case. And I've read that before on my channel, but I really love that quote because he obviously knew how ridiculous vaccination was. And he probably thought that by now we would see it too. That maybe it would be abolished, just like bloodletting was. But unfortunately, we're still at it. But there's that saying that sometimes things get really, really, really bad before they get better. Hopefully, maybe this is that breaking point. So I just wanted to read like a review because I've been going back in Dr. Creighton's book and just rereading some chapters and just taking notes. And I just want to read those notes. So the epidemic between 1817 and 1818 marked a moment of great hesitation that the profession had ever owned since cowpoxing was first agreed to. And I'd say probably there was, a strong agreement. No, maybe 1800. But even then, there were questions and things that were seen wrong. But anyway, professionals started taking up the opinions of anti-vaccinists. Gardner, Jenner's old friend, who had zeal for Jenner, also was questioning this, this theory, this cowpox theory. His vaccines were being rejected in Frampton, even by parents whose kids already had been vaccinated. July 1817, a medical journal in London reported that a great number of vaccinated people who had skillful practitioners were suffering from smallpox. And the reason that he highlights who had skillful practitioners was because that was an excuse made for the vaccination, that whoever gave it didn't give it properly. But he makes the point that there was a great number of those who had vaccinations by skillful practitioners that still were suffering smallpox. Of course, keeping the repertoire of the medical community, the reputation of the medical community was above all. Keeping that reputation unstained was the priority above keeping people safe, because they had already endorsed Edward Jenner and they didn't want to look like idiots. They have built an empire for themselves and will not allow it to suffer or come down. They were going to keep their reputation, and they weren't going to risk it all just for one mistake. The entire stock of skills, if you will, being that if people saw that they were so wrong on this, how many other things were they so wrong about? They couldn't risk that. The people had to believe that these men were the professionals, were the one who knew more than the common people. So Parliament paid Jenner in the year 1802 £10,000. And in 1807, they paid Edward Jenner £20,000. And to retract their support would be humiliating. There was money being paid to those on the vaccine board as well. So they needed to be clever as to prevent these plums from dropping into their mouths. That is a saying used by Dr. Creighton. To prevent those plums from dropping in their mouths, they needed to be clever. The College of Surgeons and the College of Physicians were the two great guilds in medicine. And if they agreed on something, then it meant automatic assent of the whole entire profession. So whatever the authorities say, the underlings will do. Jenner coerced the University of Oxford to give him a degree as a doctor of medicine in 1813. So this was after the fact. So it's funny because, people will laugh about how so-and-so wasn't qualified, or they're not qualified to talk about vaccines because they're a chiropractor or whatever. Well, Jenner obtains his Doctor of Medicine degree after he coerced them, not even went through it, and earned it. In 1813, way after he came out with the idea of vaccination and after the society had paid him money. So in 1813, he got his Doctor of Medicine by coercion from the University of Oxford. There seemed to be no alternative for managing smallpox epidemics, and the only idea was a return to the old inoculation. The old inoculators were a major part of the anti-vaccine cause. The more vaccinations seemed to fail, the more old inoculation revived. So it's kind of like a battle between two businesses. Disastrous epidemic of 1819 in Norwich turned people against vaccination and back to the old inoculation when they saw the failure and many doctors yielded to what the people wanted. Another epidemic in 1824, from 1824 to 1825, in which the smallpox hospital reported 147 patients vaccinated who had got smallpox, and 12 of them died. Sir Robert Peel was questioned about this in Parliament. Sir Henry Halford, president of the College of Physicians and the board, persuaded the government that those people were not properly vaccinated. It was an apologetic role played by the vaccine board from its first establishment. The opposition at this time, around 1825, became anonymous or was wrapped up in allegory. Thus, in 1839, John Roberton, a well-known Manchester practitioner, published in the Gazette a satirical piece showing how vaccination had failed in the island of Barataria and how officials had accounted for the failure. London Medical Gazette. An anonymous writer in the Medical Gazette published a series of letters in which he wrote, in quotes, "It is not enough for the thinking part of the profession that a few who have the management of this branch should be wedded blindly to a particular belief. However much our wishes may incline us to favor vaccination, we must not be like the advocates of Old Bailey, determined to bring off our client victorious, whether deserving or not, because truth will have its way at last, and it may be doubted whether the practitioners of the next century will not laugh at the manner in which we have been misled by Dr. Barron. This was written in the London Medical Gazette, October 19th, 1839. This was among the last allowed to appear in the English journal down until recent days in the medical journals, because of course, like today, the journals are censored. The alleged immunity of pox milkers from smallpox they know to be a popular delusion. Jenner had a fanciful ambition to see cowpox inoculation substituted for ordinary inoculation of the time. How did Jenner circumvent cowpox milkers getting smallpox? By saying spontaneous cowpox was spurious and cowpox from horse grease alone gave immunity. It's not easy to make out at what point Jenner called in the aid of horse grease. So the only experiment in 1798, in the 1798 inquiry, was Sarah Nilms, who got cowpox from a market cow. According to Jenner, that would have been spurious, spontaneous pox, and not of equine source. So Jenner contradicts himself here. His paper used, and which today is famous, contradicts his latter excuses and theory. In 1797, serious adoption of genuine and spurious plea of horse grease as the one authentic source of cowpox. Here, grease was not in the first draft of the inquiry that was given to the Royal Society. Pearson told Jenner not to put the whole horse grease in the final copy of the inquiry because it would wreck the whole concern. But horse grease was everything in his doctrine because of the spurious genuine differentiation thing. The horse grease doctrine was the beginning of vaccine apologetics and excuses as to why this protective did not work. So, Woodville and Pearson, two of Jenner's eager supporters, did not claim the horse grease doctrine. And Woodville supplied others with vaccine lymph. So, as you can see there, Jenner's original theory was that when cows got a pox from horse grease, that was the protective power against smallpox. But other men who were eager to jump on board with him did not agree with that. They thought it was ridiculous. So, I believe they used ordinary cowpox lymph, which was not supposedly from horse. Their cowpox would have been considered ordinary, spontaneous cowpox, which was the only kind until Jenner suddenly denounced it as spurious. Probably because they realized it wasn't working, so he had to do a quick quack shuffle. Seeley and other authorities used what Jenner considered spurious. Jenner was even using Woodville's vaccine lymph, even though he considered it spurious. In April of 1799, Jenner came out with another paper titled Further Observations. Spurious cowpox was the grand theme of this paper. Here it gets more confusing, and as it's not as simple as all non-horse grease cowpox is spurious, meaning that there's not a clear distinction like all non-horse grease cowpox is just not the right kind and all horse grease is. It gets confusing. So one of the ways that cowpox was not an effective protective against smallpox was if a person got horse grease without the horse grease passing through the mystical cow. So then in December 1799, Jenner made a third pamphlet titled Continuation of Facts and Observations, in which horse grease is not mentioned. Creighton says that the notion of genuineness and spuriousness, which was all Jenner wanted to establish through horse grease, was soon able to run on its own legs without support from pathology or from anything else. Spurious became a cry, and as a cry, it could be used with far more freedom and effectiveness if it were uncommitted to specific definitions. The paper, titled On the Origin of the Vaccine Inoculation, May 6, 1801, in which Jenner professes to give a concise history of the origin of vaccine inoculation. Jenner's first difficulty in the cowpox smallpox problem was cases where cowpox milkers still got smallpox. Jenner used to share about his fancy or his fantasy with cowpox, smallpox, at meetings with his medical neighbors and colleagues at their parties and gatherings. His colleagues would show cases where this popular belief was a mere verbal illusion. These exceptional cases of people getting smallpox after cowpox dampened his ardor, but did not extinguish it. Of course, the hope that kept Jenner going was that, of course, these cowpox milkers had spurious cowpox. So he was already brewing up the excuses in his own mind. The real development of true and spurious cowpox. So the inquiry calls any cowpox not derived from horse grease spurious. Unlike the inquiry in 1798, the second apologetic was the main argument of the 1799 further observations, a plea or an excuse he had to trump up to answer Ingenhousz and cover his failure with the Stonehouse cowpox in 1798, December, and failures that occurred with other physicians in Stroud with matter from the same source. So Jenner tried to stir up new excuses about why his theory wasn't working. There was another case of failure, the case of Mr. Jacobs of Bristol, of which Henry Jenner, Jenner's nephew, laid out the excuses. Cowpox, and only what he said was there's 3 different types of cowpox, 3 different ways a cow can get cowpox, and only one was genuine. Animals exposed for sale acquired inflammation in the udder, and this is the type which Sarah Nilms has, and Jenner had said it was a protective, but it's the very so basically they're saying that the animals in the market that get swollen udders and get cowpox, basically that's a false, that is not a protective. but apparently that is the same type of small cowpox pus that was the same type of cowpox that Sarah Nelms got, and that was the same type of cowpox that Jenner used to experiment on James Phipps, which they said was a protective. But then he contradicts himself and says that that is not a protective. And what's interesting is that is the story that is put on a pedestal for us today. If you ask any person about smallpox, they will probably recite to you this wonderful fairy tale. All right. So he goes against his own self and says, spurious cowpox doesn't work. But yet, in the inquiry, this was the showcase case where it did work. Anyhow, so he says that this Mr. Jacobs had spurious cowpox and that's why he wasn't protected, blah, blah, blah. The profession was somewhat impressed that Jenner's family knew the difference between what was fake and what was real cowpox. Reverend G.C. Jenner said it required little discernment to be familiar and acquainted with the difference between the two, yet they did not give clear differences. So basically, they were telling people it's easy to know the difference, but they weren't even given a description. You know what? I skipped something. Okay, so Jenner's first apologetic was that no, it didn't work because it has to be from horse grease. The horse grease has to come through the cow in order for it to be a protective. Okay, that didn't work out. So the second apologetic was, okay, it's not the origin necessarily, but it's the ulcer that it produces on the arm. If the ulcer doesn't look a certain way, then it's not the right one, right? But they provided no artwork, no description, so that other doctors would know, what's real and what's not. So in 1801, the Medical and Physical Journal said there was artists at work to make accurate representations of true and spurious pustules. In 1802, rolled around and still there were no accurate renderings of the pustules. So there was still confusion in 1802. The profession went drifting on without the rudder and compass which the editor of the medical journal thought the plates would have supplied them with. The profession in 1802 had no pathological principles or rigid facts to help them along with cowpoxing. Dr. John Fawcett of Horncastle sent in 3 cases of the medical journal of children who took smallpox after being vaccinated upon himself to declare, the editor of that journal took it upon himself to declare that these cases were spurious or fake. Even the medical journals adopted the unproven Jennerian excuses without a doubt. Another doctor followed Dr. John Stevenson in 1801. He inquires to the editor on what grounds he has a right to call the cowpox spurious. Well, of course, the true vaccine is never at fault. That pattern starts there. The idea of it is never wrong. It's always something else that's wrong. Stevenson thought the profession would awake to the illusions being practiced with names. Their idea or theory of vaccination is now never at fault. Only the conduct of the operation or an error in the nature of the matter inoculated. So it was either that whoever administered the vaccine did it wrong, or it was the wrong type of pus. And the way you can tell was by the pustule that it produced. Dunning of Plymouth, another with, he said that either the lymph has power or it does not, and the protection cannot be casual, but it needs to be regular and determined. We still face this problem today, and vaccinations are excused of their lack of ability to protect when outbreaks occur in vaccinated people. But Dunning was too deceived into thinking without Dunning too was deceived into just saying like, well, if it didn't work, then that means it was fake, because we assume that the real one does work. Again, pure assumption or deduction without evidence. So in that chapter, Dr. Creighton calls these the apologetics of vaccination. And the same discussions that were taking place in 1800 are the same. It's sad to say that they're the same discussions taking place today. Vaccination is still based on assumption, never proven to protect from anything, and very proven to harm people and cause chronic diseases and death.